Hello and welcome to the Scientology Money Project. How you doing, Jamie?
I'm doing well, Jeffrey. How are you?
Good, good. I want to welcome everyone to, let me get my music down, to the Scientology Money Project. And I got to get my smooth
If you don't
sounds
mind
down.
my call sign here, Jeffrey.
Pardon me?
My handle.
Okay, Child X. Today we have Jamie Mustard, author of Child X, a memoir of slavery, poverty, celebrity, and Scientology. Recommend. It's a great read, Jamie. It's literary. I enjoyed reading it. And you were born into the Sea Org.
Yes.
And the way you tell your story, you're really describing subhuman slum conditions, because basically Sea Org is a form of slavery. And you tell a story of how you were illiterate. I mean, functionally illiterate, if that's correct to say it that way. And you struggled against illiteracy, and you eventually worked your way into the London School of Economics. And it's an interesting story in the book. And then you earned your master's degree, and we were discussing, you wrote your thesis in the economics of slavery.
Yeah, well, I didn't get a master's degree, but I did do a thesis as part of my undergrad with
I'll correct that. Yeah. So, but you did do your undergrad in the economics of slavery.
I did.
And we've been talking, Jamie and I have been talking, and I've been away. I'm working on my manuscript for my book, long awaited. I've tried like 4 times to start. It could be hard to start a book. I finally had, an idea that crystallized. So you worked your way out of illiteracy to graduate from the London School of Economics. And, when you describe the economics of slavery, explain that term to the audience.
One could look at, well, I was functionally illiterate until I was 19 or 20 years old. At 20 years old, I didn't know how to use a comma or couldn't write a legible sentence, didn't know really quite even how to use a period or write a paragraph. And if I tried to write, it would be so illegible that it would be scratches. In fact, when I was in the movement, I worked in fundraising at 19, and there was a 14-year-old Mexican kid that barely spoke English, that worked as an office assistant for us at the Sandcastle in Central Florida in Clearwater, Pinellas County. And he would have to rewrite all of my invoices. That's how bad that, to just show you the level of not writing. So what was strange about it is I could read at a high level because I started studying the doctrine from a very young age. But I couldn't do above kindergarten math, or write even at the kindergarten level. So I had no expressive literacy. And for somebody like me at the time, I didn't know I was an intelligent person. I thought, well, I'm not literate, so I must be a stupid person. But I turned out that I wasn't, that I was smart and had a lot going on in my head. And all I can say is that when you have a lot going on in your head, mathematics and writing literacy are a primary mode of human expression. And, I couldn't really speak about it. So I felt like I was entombed within my own mind because I didn't have expressive literacy. So it felt like I was in a mental prison.
How did it make you in social interactions? Outside of the organization.
I felt like an alien. And if you saw me back then, because of all the cross currents and cognitive dissonance, it would have been like, I felt I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I felt guilty because of the way I was indoctrinated and groomed. I felt guilty for pursuing education because I had been indoctrinated since I could speak, that the outer world, the so-called Muggle or Wog world, was a middle-class wasteland of people that were asleep, and that we were the only people that were awake. And so I felt it would be hard to be around someone aside from the illiteracy and not be judging them as one of the asleep people. And then on top of that, the way I've described it in the past of social interactions is, if you've ever seen Men in Black, the first one, Vincent D'Onofrio plays a character that is taken over by an alien, a farmer that is taken over by an alien. And he kind of lurches around, he's kind of like contorted and he's lurching. That was my internal life, was just a kind of lurchy, discombobulated Frankenstein of a person.
Okay, so going back into the economics of slavery within the Scientology Sea system, and I think all of Scientology as an organization is a form of slavery, but particularly the Sea Org. So being born into the Sea Org, you're just a future unit of production.
Oh yeah,
go please. Yeah.
Okay. When I first started talking, and again, I don't see myself as an activist. I see myself as somebody that's trying to speak up for myself. What happened? I don't want the story to not go untold. I've lost a lot of friends to drug addiction and unaliving themselves. And then there's a lot of sick kids with autoimmune disease and then severe shame from the fact that from the stress that we were under. And I want to speak for them because they're not speaking. So when I first started to speak out and talk to the media, did I lose you? I don't know if I lost you or not, Jeffrey.
No, Jamie, I'm here.
Okay.
What I wanted to do is just give you the stage. So
okay.
So I want you to talk about.
It helps me.
Okay. And I'll stay on if it helps you.
Yeah, it helps you. Okay. So when I first started to speak out about this, and I would start to talk for the first time about the living conditions, and especially over the last few months, as I've been speaking about Child X, the book, and the living conditions, which are a major part of the book, I was kind of surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, when various members of the media started saying to me, I don't understand why anybody that was trying to grow a religion or do anything would have kids live like that. We're talking about, I grew up without bedding. I never learned to brush my teeth. I congealed mattresses, bunk stacked 3 high in LA hot boxes with no air conditioning, shag carpeting so dirty you couldn't see the original carpeting with chronic roaches, mice, and then when we moved to the old industrial hospital, even rats. You were talking about living conditions that I would describe as below developmental countries, or what you so-called third world countries. And we were all, as kids, living in these in Hollywood or various parts of Hollywood. And people would say, well, why would anyone even go out of their way to put kids in living conditions like that, where you were basically being treated like an animal? We were fed slop. I mean, it was just, everything was the least amount with the least amount of caretakers.
Right.
And so I started asking myself, I didn't have an instant answer to that. Like, yeah, why were we made to live like that? That was all I knew. I felt I had some internal compass that was saying something is wrong, but I didn't know any other way of living for a child. So I started to ask myself, why were we living like animals? And then I came to the conclusion, which is the correct assessment or conclusion, which is that we weren't useful to this group, so-called Scientology, until we were 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. We were not going to be useful as labor. We could start running folders by 9, and we could be doing manual labor at that point, and then we could be in the Scientology's inner core paramilitary organization that runs all of Scientology. By the age of 11 or 12, we could contribute some way. So we had this kind of 10-year gap where we were just taking attention away from our parents, consuming places to sleep, and consuming food. But we weren't useful in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I didn't go to school. That's why I was illiterate. So I came, when evaluating it, the only way I could explain it, and I know it's correct because I actually did my thesis at the London School of Economics on the economics of slavery. And the only, so I came only, this is only in the last 4 months when the media was really grilling me on this point, that we had this 10-year gap before we would be useful labor. So you have to imagine it like you, Jeffrey, you're a pig farmer and you buy a pig. Well, that pig may not be useful to you till you fed it slop for 7 years till it's big, and then you can sell it for slaughter. You're not going to put that pig up in the Ritz-Carlton. No. You're going to make sure that pig is in the simplest, easiest pig pen, with the simplest, minimalist amount of food to get it to the size where you can then sell it for slaughter as a mode of income. So I believe that we were being penned for labor, and until we were old enough to be used, in this case, rather than for slaughter, as a resource of labor.
Yes, and when we discuss slavery, the economics of it, it's not convenient when you're talking about human children to educate them beyond the bare minimum standards they need to read the doctrine and policy.
Well,
comprehend it. They don't want to build scholars.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, well, once again, you have the people who are the people that were assigned to the caretakers. You might have one, they called them nannies, ironically, whether they were male or female. And there might be, if there were 200 kids, there might be 3 to 4 caretakers.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then the people that were the least useful over at the organization, like if you can learn how to counsel people on the machine, or you could be an executive and direct people to supervise courses and make money, or you could supervise courses and make money. Those people were useful because they generated income for the organization. You know that Hubbard once said, the purpose of an organization is to make money and make more money and make money. You know the quote.
Sure.
So anybody that was useful, they couldn't have over taking care of the kids. So the kind of dejects that couldn't be useful as income sources were sent to be the nannies within the so-called C organization.
Yeah, you're going to put your suboptimal people in charge of you're spending the least amount possible to warehouse children.
They sent
horrible living conditions.
Yeah, they sent the paramilitary members over that were absolutely useless someplace else. They could sit there and stare at a child and tell a child what to do. And that was really what it was. I mean, I get into it in very specific detail in Child X. So when I first went to the London School of Economics and I started to study economic history, I was taken under the wing of a professor named Gareth Austin, who's now at Cambridge. And I started to, and I changed my major from focusing on pure economics to specializing in economic history. And Gareth was a professor of African economic history. So it made sense that I became interested in his classes. He supervised my thesis. And I was kind of shocked when I walked into this first African economic history class, because I had always understood slavery watching TV, and then the minimal history I did before I went to LSE as a kind of moral evil,
Yes.
where I imagined white men marching into the interior of Africa like Elmer Fudd with elephant guns and rounding up black people, as some sort of concept of domination and superiority of control. Like my understanding of slavery before going to England was this is about domination, superiority, control, kind of racism. That was my mind, and it was incredibly naive of me. So I walk into this class, and there's no talk of moral superiority. There's no talk of racism. There's no talk of domination, and there's only a talk of you have these large populations in sub-Saharan Africa where they have what in economics we would call labor extensive resource gathering. In other words, it doesn't take a lot of labor to gather resources to survive. Hunter-gatherers, they've been there for tens of thousands of years. They know how to catch the game. They know how to get the nuts and harvest the fruits and the berries. So that subsistence living in sub-Saharan Africa, again, would be called labor extensive, tons of people, and not a lot of labor required for them to survive. All right, so while that's been going on, the New World is found, the Caribbean is found, and colonization is finding all these new territories with the advent of ships. And with the advent of ships comes the advent of the Middle Passage, bringing people from sub-Saharan Africa to places like the Caribbean in the New World. The way this is being presented to me, day one, is as a labor shift. Now, the New World is harsh. And in order to create viable agriculture in the New World, this is what they call labor-intensive production. In other words, the agriculture necessary to cultivate, which is not what hunter-gatherers do, and then create an abundance of cultivation, more than you need for your plantation or settlement, so that you have extra that you can barter with or trade with. This is incredibly labor intensive. So from day one, there's no talk of anything other than the entire slave trade is only an economic event. It is a labor shift from a place with labor extensive production to a place that requires a massive amount of labor intensive production to produce output. And I just remember in those first couple of weeks, it giving me pause. Like, how could they dare talk about this evil in terms of just a labor shift? But then after studying it for 3 weeks and settling in, it became clear to me that's all it ever was. That's what racism is built on. Is you have to, if you're going to own and steal a person or buy and purchase a person, you would have to dehumanize them and lessen them to justify it. And when you have locations, even the backwardness, the so-called backwardness of Africa, and backwardness of other places that are geographically close to the equator, is the foundation of an economic system. If you're close to the equator, so that there's tons of game and natural fruits, berries, vegetables growing around you, you actually don't need to develop technology. But in places that have cold winters, you need to cultivate to survive. So that's why Europe developed technology, was through cultivation. And so places that we go, well, why, if they're not inferior, why are they so behind in wearing loincloths? Because you don't have to develop technology in places that have a lot of heat and a lot of wet.
Yeah.
because things grow there naturally, and there's an abundance of game naturally. So within a few weeks, it was very obvious to me as I kind of dug into my studies that slavery was only ever purely an economic system. It was never a system of racism to start. It was never a system of evil to start. It was a way, they couldn't get the natives in the New World to produce. They would rather die. They wouldn't be taken as slaves. And that makes sense because in order to enslave someone, you kind of have to take them out of the environment and take away their past and take away their history and put them in a place of absolute crippling vulnerability. And then they will be pliable. So we're never going to be able to make indigenous people in North America and the Caribbean into slaves because they had a history there and they had places they could go and escape to, and they knew the land. And so once I had that realization, it very much changed my view of the world. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, because of course it does, but it exists more when someone can make a profit. It's an economic system.
Yeah, well, translating that over to Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard, it's interesting because I first started studying Scientology decades ago, and I saw it as a systematic wealth extraction scheme that depended upon targeting upper, middle, and high-income individuals. Because at the cost of doing Scientology, there's not enough money in the world to clear the planet. If you had 7.3 billion people and they had to pay for the bridge, there's just not enough money in the world. So Hubbard's goal to clear the planet is not economically viable. He never intended it to be.
It got worse over the years. In the 70s and late 60s, it was
relatively affordable. But
yeah.
What I was saying is, in order for Hubbard to enact his wealth extraction scheme, he needed a labor shift and he took, back there in that 70s, he took idealistic young people off the streets and gave them the idea that they would save the world. He was really enslaving them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. He needed to extract people from the industrial workforce, either as factory floor workers or managers. And
he needed a workforce.
Yeah, he needed a workforce.
And he because he didn't want to pay anybody anything, he used something that religions use forever, and that's like a vow of poverty. When he created the paramilitary organization for purposes of control and intelligence, that's how most people think of OSA, Office of Special Affairs. But the Sea Org is fundamentally labor. I have a recruiting postcard. They don't send them out anymore. But when you look at FLAG, they want gardeners, cooks, maids, sommeliers, chefs, people to clean the pool. It's all labor to service the paying clients. But they also need people to clean the bilges, to clean the grease traps in the kitchens. So there's a lot of menial labor involved. And so Hubbard, looking at the economics of Scientology as a slave system on one side, to enable Hubbard to engage in systematic wealth extraction on the other side. So while he's promising people the states of clear NOT, he has this captive group that are effectively, he's taken away their identity. Yours at birth, which you do with slaves, you take away their name. And you're not Jamie Mustard, you're a Sea Org member or a cadet.
I'm a cadet.
Yeah, you're a cadet. So by redefining personhood in terms of an identity, that's been historically true in slavery, to take away your real name, to take away your native tongue, to give you another identity. And to take you out of your environment into a very hyper-controlled environment where you never leave the premises.
Yeah.
Jamie, may I say something?
Sure.
Every night I walk my dog. down Franklin. Okay. That's my red borzoi, Sebastian. His job is to walk me every night for an hour. And every night I see the Searg buses going to and fro because I walk late, sometimes at 10, sometimes at 11, sometimes at midnight. But I see the Searg buses going up and down Franklin. They turn on a certain street and go back to what they call berthing. So the confinement, okay, so let's go back a step further. There's illiteracy. You only need to be literate to the point where either you can count money or read policy and doctrine, but you don't need to be truly educated in any fundamental sense. You just need to be functionally educated within the confines of this slave organization and Hubbard doctrine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening.
So then your expectation, like, did you know when you were young it was expected of you that you'd work the rest of your life to clear the planet? Or was there no nobility, or was it so degrading you didn't even think of purpose?
Yes and no. I was told that that's what my parents were doing, my mother was doing, and that we had to save the planet, and that my job was to kind of be there in these animalized conditions and bear it with a smile, or we wouldn't have a planet to live on in the future. I was also told that we would salvage the planet within 6 months to a year at one point when I got curious at 5 or 6 years old. And then I would be able to see my mother again once the planet, with some consistency, once the planet was salvaged.
That's astonishing. When you're talking about economics of slavery, you're talking about an ideology that you grew up in, this ideology that you didn't even know enough to question. So you don't realize you're a slave. So Hubbard does this thing to members of the paramilitary where he gives them a different identity. You're members of an elite group, which, if you're living in slum conditions, is the conditions you describe: unwashed, filthy sheets.
No sheets.
Well, yeah, often no sheets.
Yeah.
No sheets, cramped bunks, just crap for food, no medical treatment. You're out on
the term birthing, which is the paramilitary so-called Sea Org term. I don't want to say the word Sea Org.
We'll talk about the paramilitary.
But even the term birthing has an animalized notion to it. Just this idea where you stick something for its minimum period of rest before it can be pulled out again to graze.
Yeah, birthing, and they even have a punishment in the paramilitary called pig's birthing. So when the older members transgress, they're put into pig's birthing.
Well, even as kids, when I look back, this is something that really frustrates me, and I write about this in the book, is they raised us like animals.
Yeah.
We acted like animals. It was Lord of the Flies. And then we were raised to be dirty. I never learned to brush my teeth. I didn't have underwear. I didn't have sheets. I'm at 3 years old. I'm in the third bunk. With crammed full of kids. I'm waking up at 6 a.m. to a military structure of kids in dirty, ramshackle military clothes. That system is that physical. Let's compare it to slavery. Okay, yes. If you were to go back to a plantation in the South and go look, you have plenty of plantations that have been preserved, and you can go look at the manor house of the plantation where the cotton was, oversaw, and then you could look at the slave quarters. Now, if you went into slave quarters and then you went into a corral where pigs were kept or chickens, the slave quarters, the physical conditions of the slave quarters would barely be above the conditions in which the animals were living, right? So the comparison isn't subtle, it's exact.
Yes, and one thing that I was intrigued by in your book, but also a little shocked somewhat, you discuss your grandparents in the book.
Oh, sorry, Jeffrey. One thing
Wait.
I was going to say was with the
Oh,
pig's
yeah,
birthing.
please. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Is they raised us to be dirty, and then they would stick those signs on the doors of our dorm rooms. When they got really dirty, they would literally, when we were 5, 6 years old, 4 years old, 7 years old, you'd wake up one morning and one of the quote caretakers had put a sign on the door saying pigs birthing. And
Hmm.
so they raised us like pigs and they labeled us pigs.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate dehumanization. You're a pig. You're a pig, and you don't even notice the body odor at a certain point or the filth.
If you'd walked
And
in, yeah, it smelled
yeah,
like, yeah, the body
yeah,
odor is a big part of it.
yeah. Well, the reason I mention your grandparents,
Yeah.
you get to see them, and you tell the story where your grandmother. Tell us about your grandparents, but she puts you in the bathtub when you go fly out to the East Coast to see her out of the asphalt and concrete slum of East Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we're talking
Where's your first contrast that another world exists?
there, New York.
Yeah, tell the audience about it, because this is a fascinating part of your book when your
Yeah,
grandma first. How
yeah, I
old
mean,
are you? What happens?
okay, so first of all, one of the things you have to understand about this is I was turned over on the day of my birth. So
Yeah.
now my mother's disputed that in a Daily Mail article. Okay, that's
Yes.
recent. I would say to her, if that's not true, um, well, I don't know if she disputes that part. Okay,
Yeah.
but if she did dispute it, and I think she probably would, um, I would say produce a baby picture.
Yeah.
Produce one single baby picture. Don't produce 3 baby pictures. Don't produce 2 baby pictures. Produce one picture of me in the first 5 years of my life. One.
Yeah.
She couldn't do it because unless I was off with family on a rare outing every 2 years or so, there would be no pictures taken because there was no parent there to take it.
Yeah.
But at 4 years old, my grandmother flew us to New York, to her house in Westchester County, New York, where she lived at the end of a cul-de-sac. And happy to see her grandkids, which she was very troubled over how they were living.
Yeah.
She fed us warm milk and honey and ginger snaps. It was so alien. It was the warmth of the emotion and the warmth of the honey, the milk and honey and the ginger snaps was so shocking. It was uncomfortable. Like the rug could be pulled out at any second. And also, all I would be thinking about from the moment I arrived on those trips every couple of years, even if I was there for 2 weeks, the day I would arrive is all I would be thinking about was going back. And I had anxiety and nausea in the pit of my stomach from day one. But the time you're talking about is I'm 4 years old,
Yeah.
and trigger alert, it's kind of graphic.
I know, but it's a story that needs to be told. I know it's hard, but I
Yeah,
was shocked when I read it. I'm a parent.
yeah.
I,
My
I,
grand, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't. If it's upsetting, but it's important. I think this is an important element when your grandma this event at 4, telling
Yeah,
your story.
yeah. So she at 4 years old, she sticks me in the tub and she's smiling, and just like this grandmother
Yeah,
seeing her grandchild for the first time in years. Um, my I was one of her older grandchildren, so one of her second grandchild ever. And I looked like her. I can trace my family back to 1865, just before 1865. So back to slavery and back to being freed slaves on my mother's side. And so I look like her. I come from a long line on my mother's side of light skinned Black people. And so here's this woman who came from a strong family under Jim Crow in the American South. Her father was the town doctor in Henning, Tennessee, where Alex Haley grew up, and was my Aunt Lucy's best friend.
Hmm.
My grandmother remained close with Alex Haley to his death, with regular visits to his farm. And so she has all of this warmth and excitement to see her grandchildren. So the first night we're there, she comes to get me in the room that was always designated for the kids. And she said, "Come on, Jamie, let's take a bath. I better run a warm bubble bath for you."
Yeah.
And of course, that's exciting. I'd never had a bath run for me in my entire life beyond what the caretakers did, which was horrific at what I would call the Baby Factory or the Asho Day House on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles, 811 Beacon Street, in a slum not far from MacArthur Park and the Rampart Police Station. I talk about how we were bathed in there, but I don't want to. And people should read the book because it's
just read the book. Yeah.
It's horrifying. But so this is probably the first time in my life that I'm being warmly put into a bubble bath, like what any other child might be experiencing from the time they're 6 months old or a baby, right? I'm having this experience for the first time at 4. And my grandmother is ebullient. She is so excited to be sharing this moment with this child. I mean, I'm just looking at this joy and excitement on this woman's face. And I remember it because that was never a look that I saw in my life. I didn't see people approaching me and caring for me with joy. So it was very foreign. Like, where is this joy coming from? Why would she be excited to see me when no one else in my life previously has ever been excited to see me? So it was a feeling of internal warmth. I had a stepfather that was warm, but I didn't get to see him all the time. And here was this woman that I didn't know that was next level warm. Okay, in terms of, I would use the word excited. And she is just rapturous in her face, like on the verge of almost laughter. Her eyes are wide and shining as she's putting her grandchild into this bath. And she puts me down in the bath and she stands up with pride and she's looking down and her face turns black with a grimace. And she screams for my stepfather and to get the car. And I'm instantly wrested from this tub, put a bare minimum of clothes on me, and carried to a car where I'm rushed to the emergency room with an infection so extreme in my lower extremities that it could have gone septic and killed me.
Yeah.
And the only reason that was occurring, because at that point we were living in the dorms on Melrose and Van Ness, is because no one ever looked at my body. And so one thing that was a constant thrum was medical neglect. And that medical neglect occurred for a couple of reasons. One is no one looked at my body. 2 is illness is handled through Scientology doctrines and processes that improve illness. So unless you're about to die, you don't go to the doctor. You don't need to get blood work done. You need to do Scientology counseling, which will heal any physical ailment. So we don't go to the doctor if you're sick. If you're not feeling well, you're put in isolation and you're given Scientology processes. Now, when you're young and your body has a strong immune system and you're vibrant, that works. But when you're an older member of the paramilitary and you're 55 years old and you're smoking and you don't ever get blood work done, you have a heart attack and you die.
Yeah.
Because everything is being handled through counseling and doctrine, not science and blood work. But it set this, so that level of medical neglect continued. I didn't have, I wasn't given painkillers. So I probably didn't have my first Advil until I was 23 years old.
But just let me ask, so your grandmother gets your medical condition handled.
Well, she
Yeah.
brought me to
Yeah.
the emergency room,
Yeah.
and I was put on an infusion of antibiotics and then sent home with antibiotics and
Yeah.
saved. Right?
But your grandmother saved your life.
She saved my life.
And this is interesting because, when I was growing up, and this is the contrast, because property, chattel, you don't spend money on when you can put them on a machine to, uh, supposedly cure things. But when I was growing up, it was, bath every night, check fingernails, toenails, brush teeth, check hair. You were expected. And when I'd go to my grandma's, sometimes my parents would, have to go out of town. It would be bubble bath, fingernails, toenails. Are you manicured, groomed? Let me cut your toenails, dear. I adored my grandmother, and in a lot of ways, she was more of a mom to me than my mother. That's a different story. But cleanliness is next to godliness, but when you're running cheapest way to go, you don't care. It's sort of like you make it or you don't. But you had an untreated condition that could kill you, but no one ever checks on your well-being.
Yeah, I mean, it was very weird.
It's
At
like,
one point, they sent us to Vanessa Elementary School for
yeah,
a couple months,
we
and because I didn't have any education and I was 5 years old, 6 years old, they thought that they thought that I was um, uh, had a learning disability, not that I wasn't being educated. So they stuck me in a class
hmm.
for
I'm sorry. Say that again. What happened? Yeah,
they sent me to like what they would send me to school sometimes for 4 weeks here, 2 months there, right? I mean, I probably spent a month or two at Van Ness Elementary School,
was
and then
this to meet legal requirements?
I don't know why they did it. And
Yeah.
then
Okay.
when we moved to the Big Blue building, the complex, as we call it, then they sent me to Lockwood Elementary School for about 6 weeks, 2 months before they changed the plan again. But when I was 5, and they sent me to Van Ness Elementary School because I had no education even for a 5-year-old. They thought that I had a learning disability, so they
I
stuck
see.
me in a class of kids with learning disabilities, and they didn't teach us anything. We just kind of sat around and did posture and played games.
Yeah.
And I was there for maybe 6 weeks, maybe less. I mean, time seems really long when you're young. And then one day, one of the teachers in the learning disability class saw that I didn't have underwear and sent me home. And then I don't know if I went back after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is
So
interesting. We were talking about a policy letter. I don't know if we'll get to it to this show or next, but basically there was a policy letter in the paramilitary to do the minimum required for children. Minimum, whatever they can, where they have to legally comply, they will. And this is something I brought up before. Uh, David Miscavige's private attorney, and this all comes from Hubbard doctrine, okay? But Monique Yingling, she's the consigliere of the crime boss, right? Of Scientology as a criminal organization, human trafficking, which is where we're going. But we're just showing its roots in childhood when you were born into it, stripped of your humanity altogether, given a different identity. Monique Yingling made a statement that I thought it was shocking to me. It should never be made by anyone, religious, secular. She said, "We adhere to all uh, standards of child labor." I'm thinking you should never have child labor. You're a multi-billion-dollar organization and you're using child labor, and you're not even telling the story. We warehouse very young children in unsanitary, filthy, and squalid conditions, and we lie about it. They don't get medical treatment. There's a lot Monique
yeah,
Yingling did not say.
that medical neglect continued,
Yeah.
where I I went back to New York a couple of years later and
Hmm.
ended up same thing. Like I had an issue with my hearing. My mother kept telling my grandmother I was faking, and she proved it to my grandmother by whispering from a distance about getting ice cream. But
Hmm.
because I had an infection in my ears and the mucus would move in and out, sometimes I could hear.
Yeah.
But she was telling my grandmother I was faking. She didn't even know me. I'm living in these dorms. She's coming to visit me. Why would you think your kid was fake hearing? Right?
Yeah,
This is a
that's
level of delusion and cognitive dissonance. My mom, like, well, there was a black pediatrician named Lucille Gunning who had interned under my grandfather. My grandfather was a flight surgeon during World War II, and so my grandmother, who is almost like a Buddhist monk in demeanor, and never was able to talk to people without conflict. She just said to my mother, well, Lucille Gunning is in the neighboring town. She would love to see you. She saw my mom grow up. And why don't we just pop by and see Lucille and she can take
yeah.
a look at Jamie? So we go over there. This is 2 years later. And again, and she, Lucille brings me into her home medical office, this tall, lanky, black Caribbean woman, uh, physician in New Rochelle, New York. And she starts poking around in my ears for a few minutes, and very sweet, smiling, warm, loving.
Yeah.
I mean, she got her first internship was with my grandfather, so she had a tremendous amount of beaming affection towards me because she knew my grandfather at this point was deceased, but she knew that I was Roy Gilmer's grandson, who had been in a very important part of her life when she completed medical school. When you completed medical school, there weren't tons of options for young black female physicians in 1940s, even in New York, right?
Yeah.
So 1950s, even in New York. This is long before the civil rights movement. So my grandfather was an incredibly important figure in her life. And so I'm getting that affection. She's poking around for a few minutes. How does that feel? It's cold steel in my ears. And then she finishes. She said, Jamie, I'm going to, let's get your grandma. And she says, Dorothy, you can come on in now. And very calmly, right in front of me, Lucille Gunning, Dr. Lucille Gunning, says to my grandmother, okay. So she starts writing on a piece of paper. You're going to put Jamie in the car right now, and you're going to drive him to this hospital in Manhattan. And I'm going to make a phone call, and there you're going to talk to this doctor who's going to be waiting for you. And Jamie's going to be getting an operation.
Wow.
And it's emotional. And instantly get in the car, drive to Manhattan, go to this hospital, doctor's waiting. And, you're a 6, 7-year-old little kid. And they're talking in front of me. So my mother's there, and the doctor starts explaining to my mother, he poked around. He explains to me that I'll be going into, I don't know if it was that night or if it was 6 o'clock in the morning, but it was within 12 hours of arriving in the I mean, I was instantly put into a hospital bed. And she starts explaining to my grandmother and my mother, the male doctor, excuse me, and my grandmother and my mother in front of me, that he doesn't know if he's going to be able to save my hearing.
Wow.
And that night I had my adenoids taken out and my tonsils removed with a severe infection. And I wasn't allowed to take showers or have water grow in my ears for the next 5 to 8 years or something, because the tubes have to grow back. So I couldn't go into a pool. If occasionally once a year we went to the beach or to a public pool and an excursion from the dorms, I wasn't allowed to go in the water. And if I was even near water, I was forced to wear silly putty in my ears.
So you had a chronic long-term infection that damaged your hearing to the point you needed emergency surgery.
Yeah.
Had it not been for emergency medical intervention, you would have lost your hearing.
Yeah, it was, if had I not been brought to New York a couple of years later, like my grandmother kept being there kind of right when I was on the precipice.
Yeah, it's angels, as
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah.
And and when you look at slavery as an economic system, the last thing you're going to pay for is medical care, unless it's absolutely uh, unless it's some absolute disaster.
I mean, it
I
is.
mean, the stories I've heard. Here's a, I had interviewed a former exec at Flag, um, and I don't recall his name. An older public at Flag, and
Executive in Clearwater, Florida.
yes,
Okay.
when in 2014, when I was doing a lot of work on an oral history project, interviewing former execs and collecting statements, as you know. One of the executives told me, and this is so you're what you're describing is spending the least amount of money possible, not checking on health or well-being, diet. They don't care. It's whatever can get the piglet to become a productive unit of labor and a income producing SEERG member, or a labor producing SEERG member, right? And there was an older public, that's the wealth extraction side of this criminal organization. He was at Flag, which is one of their major bases for services, and he had apparently a stroke. And the last thing Flag wants, you know, is for someone to die on their property. He was taken out and put on a public bus bench so that if he died, he apparently was post-stroke, or he just had a stroke. He was parked on a public bench, and somebody called, for paramedics because an old man was unconscious on a bench, and the taxpayers picked up the bill. The church knew nothing about it. The organization at Flag didn't want the expense. They didn't want another Lisa McPherson. That's another part of this horrendous equation, but they didn't want a repeat of that. So we're just getting into your story. We're coming up on an hour. We should do another one because we haven't even gotten into what we were discussing, but you've described like
Well, if
your
you were to go and look at the animal conditions of a slave plantation and look at the slave quarters, there wouldn't be, the slave quarters would have a little bit more, but again, it's the minimum amount. Would it cost that much more for the plantation owner to make the living conditions for the slaves a little bit better? Probably not. Would it dig into their profit? Not that much. Probably not.
but
But
that's not the
the problem is
point.
they're being associated with a vessel of labor in an animal. So you're not going to take a cow or a bull and give it extra because it's not human. And that was
No,
how we were treated.
yeah, that's absolutely, yeah, the dehumanization of from birth.
Yeah, from birth.
And
So
and your story is consistent. It's completely consistent with the testimony of so many people who were born into the Sea Org.
yeah,
You
one
know,
thing I would also say, Jeffrey, is as I got older and I started to see people that were older people have medical conditions, this would have been when we moved to the building across from the complex, the big blue building in Hollywood that everybody sees in television. Um, you would see whenever somebody had a medical issue, they would go to a medical liaison officer and they would try to handle it with vitamins and counseling.
yeah,
And if that didn't work and they had to go to the hospital because they had a condition, a grave condition, they were always sent to the state hospital at no expense.
yeah, up in Silmar or UCLA or the USC. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they were coached on how to present themselves at the hospital as an indigent.
Yeah.
and
Yeah. So
and
my,
and so it's a lot of taking in as much as possible. A former SEERG member,
so
John,
again, Scientology, and if you want Scientology, if you want to call it that, Hubbard's
yeah,
system,
yeah, Hubbard system, yeah,
Hubbard's paramilitary system, not only were they tax exempt, but then they would fraudulently get all medical expenses paid through state hospitals.
absolutely.
Yeah.
When I study
I'm
nine
telling you, I
nine,
mean, I saw it over and over. I went with my mother to the
oh,
state hospital downtown LA. I went with my stepfather. And then when John Mustard died, he ended up at one in Silmar. So, this was standard operating procedure for all I ever saw. So they did this for decades, and they're probably still doing it.
Yeah, it's to shift all the expenses onto the taxpayer while using, abusing LAPD services and whatever else.
Yeah,
Um, and uh, in terms of medical, if they can shoehorn it into workman's comp, they will. I talked to another executive who said if there's any cost, we try to put it to make it a workman's comp thing. Um, but in the next show, maybe the next show we do, I want to show you like once you become in that 12 to 10 to 15-year-old, because I think
I think
Karen's son Alexander.
yeah. I mean, I think we need
Yeah,
to like. I would summate it like this.
yeah,
Okay. Once I got to do B9, they started having me do some physical labor, which I detail in the book, which is pretty extraordinarily
right.
dangerous. And then, and I'm also doing things like running folders. Okay. Once you get to be 12, 13, they just start upping the amount of responsibility they put on you in terms of how you can function for them. Once you get to be 12 or 13, some kids can start training to be a counselor. The
Yeah,
counselors can pull in, I don't know what it, $500 to $1,000 an hour for the organization.
yeah,
So I think what's really important in summating this is now I've been in this thing my whole life and I'm doing labor at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. I have no education. I have no history. I have no understanding of the world outside of the very small habitat in which I'm living. So, what has been done to me is absolutely, and I didn't realize this until I wrote the book. I never thought about it. It was my publisher's idea to write the book in relation to my family history. I thought he was crazy. I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to, I don't see it. I don't know what you're talking about. And then I lived with it for a couple of days and it came crashing down on me and I agreed.
yeah. I
But
think that makes the book I think it makes the book outstanding. One of
yeah,
the things that makes it outstanding.
yeah. But what I want understood here, because, I have this degree in economic history. I specialized in African economic history as an accident. The guy that mentored me and brought me in to LSC just happened to be a professor of African American economic history. If he had been a professor of Latin American economic history, I would have studied that. If he had been a professor of econometrics, I would have studied that. This guy saw me and pulled me in and gave me an opportunity.
Yeah, he
Okay.
saw something in you, and that story of how you got into LSC will have to be told in a subsequent interview.
Yeah, but
Because
the
how,
point of
how
it,
how someone like you winds up at LSC, that's a fascinating story.
yeah, it is a fascinating story. But what I want understood here is like I'm not creating a metaphor when I talk about the animalization of the conditions being a direct representation of a slave system. This is not a metaphor. This is not symbology. This is not a parable. This is an exact systemic copy of the system that my ancestors that I can trace right back to 1865. My family between 1865 and 1940, 75 years, accomplished astonishing things for freed slaves in terms of generational wealth and just a bevy of medical professionals, mostly through the historically black colleges, historically black college and universities of Rust College and Meharry Medical School. And so when I started to look at what happened to me in writing Child X and started to research my family history, this was a systemic blueprint, repeat of a blueprint of how to enslave somebody. This is not metaphorical,
No, not
right?
at all.
Zero
And
edu- are slaves educated?
no,
Okay. Can slaves read? Can slaves
no,
write? Are slaves aware of their? Did I know that I had this rich, incredible family history of people that rose out of the ashes of slavery like a phoenix on fire? No, I had no idea of my history. My history had been stripped from me exactly as it would have been had I been stuck on a boat on the Gold Coast and made the Middle Passage. right?
Yeah.
An exact replica of that system, but done to me and a ton of white kids in the middle of the United States of America in the 1970s. This happened. And the book was brutal to write because I'd never looked at it before, even though I had a degree in this.
Yeah.
And the realization of facing the realities of the systemic and I don't maybe the procedural um, enslavement of me and the other kids who I was there with, who were mostly white, and seeing that for what it was in an exactitude was emotionally overwhelming. I'm still releasing energy from the realization. I'm
I can
still
I can understand that.
the book
Yeah.
only came out a month ago, Jeffrey. I'm still processing this.
Oh yeah,
Right.
we talk and uh the courage to write it, I admire you for that. And it, I'm glad that you're reframing this because my blog, the Scientology Money Project, I've always wanted to do forensic, legal, financial, analytical, taxes, crime, right? And I think properly understood, Scientology, some of the elements to cosmology have nothing to do with what you're describing as the actual
I
bedrock
think,
of it.
yeah,
The
and I think,
bedrock of it is not the cosmology. That's
you
a
know,
distraction, a sideshow.
it is, it is.
Yeah,
And one of the things that you and I talked about early on, as we became friendly, was, hey, man, how come the Scientology Money Project? I mean, I was, not as an accusation, but can the
yeah.
Scientology Money Project cover the economic system of the systematic enslavement of children from birth in Scientology's paramilitary organization? This is the Scientology Money Project. The only reason we lived in those physical conditions, the only reason we weren't educated, uh, you can't leave if you have no education. You're impoverished by your service. You're impoverished,
It
and
is.
you have no understanding of the world. You are put in a mental prison from birth if you're birthed in the paramilitary organization. This is 100% built around an inexpensive labor force in the exact model, not similar, not parable, not metaphor, the exact model of chattel slavery.
I'm glad you said that. And yes, what I want to focus on when we talked about the economics of slavery, the narratives are all very valuable. They focus on brutality, and there certainly was a great deal of brutality underneath the incredible brutality. The people who've unalived themselves, who are homeless or overdosed. Underneath that is a system of economic slavery.
Yeah,
And this
I
is,
yeah, sorry.
yeah, not what I'm saying is it's a system of economic slavery that serves as the labor force that on the other side engages in systematic wealth extraction. And this hellishly, this hellish system depends on First Amendment protections, which is horrendous. That's why the linchpin is and always been to go after their tax exemption. So I couldn't have. I want you to tell your story and help reframe it in economic terms as a classic model of economic slavery, so it
Yeah, and
expands the understanding.
thank you, and I want to thank you and the Scientology Money Project for covering this as an economic event. The
Yeah,
way we were treated, there could not be a more appropriate platform for what happened to us as kids that were born into this paramilitary organization. There could not be a more appropriate platform for us to tell our story and for our story to be documented than the Scientology Money Project. It's all about money. And it's
it
all
is.
about how can we get the most amount of labor for the least amount of money, which is why the Middle Passage occurred and people were brought from sub-Saharan Africa to the New World and the Caribbean and other places around the world.
Yeah. I'll end with this one question. Describe the middle passage in the organization's paramilitary. What is the middle passage? Is it recruitment in? Nowadays, after the hippies and of the 70s went into, got their hair cut and went into the paramilitary Sea Org. Does
Whoa.
the middle passage now come from where do they get their recruits?
I think it's a really interesting question. And, if you're a person that was born into slavery, your middle passage is your birth on the plantation. Okay. If you're a person that was brought, and again, the whole experience of studying African economic history was very eye-opening for me. I, watched cartoons and I thought white people went into the interior of Africa with elephant guns and brought black people. When I studied this and I found that it was only black people that sold black people, and black people would enslave each other when there was a gun slave cycle. And there was also a tobacco and rum slave cycle. When during colonization, when black tribes realized that they could get tobacco, rum, and firearms, the major trading goods of the day, for people, they left other forms of economic activity like gold mining, and they became slave sellers. Because rum, tobacco, European vanity items, and guns were the currency of the day. And so every single person that was brought over on the Middle Passage, because I want to answer your question, was sold by a black person to a white slaving ship, a slaving ship to slavers, people that bought slaves and then brought them over and then sold them, slave traders. In Scientology, they recruit you from your working class or middle class life, and they bring you into a system called the Estates Project Force.
Right.
And for anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, maybe on average, sometimes longer. And in that, it's a transitional period, like a boot camp. You can't expect someone that's living in a nice apartment or a nice house to walk in and go move into a dirty slum dorm that smells like horses in Lebanon Hall of the old hospital and expect them to get the work in any sort of productive way, because it's not what they're accustomed to. You have to groom, indoctrinate, inculcate them into being a slave. So Hubbard created the system, what he called, he had fancy names for very, very destructive systems. And that's why I don't like to use the language. But what he called this was the Estates Project Force.
So that's the transition.
Yeah, where you're put to work doing 5 hours of indoctrination a day, and then another 10 to 12 hours of hard labor a day. So you're Estates Project Force. You're only doing physical labor. You're cleaning the grounds. You're doing construction. Mostly you're doing cleaning and remodeling, or you're some sort of, you might be doing demolition. I did demolition when I was on the Estates Project Force. And you're living in a dorm. And what they're doing is they're acclimating you to the impoverished system. Even the adults live in a highly impoverished dorm system. Even the adults have slum dorms. If you go inside the dormitories in that giant blue building in Hollywood, these are slum conditions. You might you might have a 300 square foot, let's say a 500 square foot room with 20 beds in it, stacked 3 high, with 3 feet between each steel bunk bed. These are, again, even for the adults, animalistic conditions. No one's going to walk in and do that. So they have this intermittent thing, kind of like a boot camp, where they acclimate you to conditions of servitude, and where you're heavily indoctrinated, and then you're adjusting to the hard labor, and you're adjusting to the living conditions. And once they see that, and they kind of push you through the system of induction or intro, then they release you and you become part of the bigger machine. And it's just every single person that comes into the Hubbard's paramilitary organization, the so-called Sea organization, is put through the Estates Project Force, which I would say is a middle passage occurring in Scientology paramilitary organizations all over the world. That is the middle passage, the Estates Project Force.
That's an interesting observation. I would like to ask one concluding question, just to get your opinion on it. People who had children when you could have children in the Sea Org, they would abandon their children like you were abandoned by your Sea Org mother. Publics, why do they give their children to the Sea Org if they're under 18? Why would they allow that? Why? This has always perplexed me. Why would you allow your child to go? One, do publics know how bad it is in the Sea Org, or are there two different domains of existence? And why would they allow their
public? Sorry, I didn't mention.
No, go ahead.
No public ever sees the living conditions on the inside. So the office spaces where public takes services and courses are never as bad as the living conditions.
So you're kept segregated.
Yeah,
in a ghetto, and the public never sees it.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness to them, over the years, in various parts of the world, they have improved some of the dormitories. They have. Yeah. And then in places where you have people interacting with celebrities, like the so-called Celebrity Center on Franklin and Bronson, the Chateau, those inner Navy members were some of the first people to get better living conditions. And part of that, they got it first, probably because they're interacting with celebrities. So that's
you cannot body odor.
Yeah, but you can have body odor. But for most of my childhood, when I would go into the adult dormitories, and I was even put in adult dormitories at 9 years old, and where adults did and said very adult things around me. I lasted about a week, and I begged to go back into the horrific, neglectful conditions of the child dorms, because the adult dorms as a 9-year-old were just overwhelming for me.
Wow, that is amazing.
I was in Lebanon Hall. I mean, it was just, the terror of going to sleep in these adult dorms where you could smell the musty smell of the unwashed human form. And, adults living like that as a child, it was like that week before I begged to go back, it was like living with monsters. And at that time, they were pulling people, there would be homeless people that they would pull off the street that needed a place to stay and live, that would join the so-called Sea organization, the Hubbard paramilitary, just to house themselves. So in these dorms, I was put in there with, I was in a very vulnerable position as a 9-year-old child. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, there is I would argue that the middle passage, if you survive it, because you have people living in their own sick. They're treating them like animals. In fact, I'm a huge Steven Spielberg fan, but I can't watch Amistad. And I love Steven Spielberg because he Disneyfies the living conditions in those slave holds on the Middle Passage, and it sickens me to watch because I'm not going anti-Spielberg because I love him, but it's so Disneyfied, it's unbearable for me to watch because I studied it.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't the living conditions for most of my childhood in the main building of the Big Blue Building, in the Lebanon Hall addendum to the Big Blue Building, not as bad as the slave ship, but I would argue that the adults were living completely animalized.
That is, I'm glad that we could talk today and have the podcast. I want to continue through a series.
Please.
Please.
Answer that question. We can be done. The reason they would turn their children over is this.
Yeah.
They've sunk all their money in while their kids are growing up for the last 10 years, 20 years, or 10 years, because they're putting, up until the 80s. These kids were joining at 7, 8, 9. They banned it in the mid 80s. But they still had kids going in at 14 to 16, even after they banned it.
Wow.
So after 15 years, anywhere between 7 to 18 years, 20 years, there are these even sometimes wealthy parishioners, so-called parishioners, adherents, I'll call them, are turning their children over in droves. And they're all doing it, and they're all doing it unquestioningly. They're doing it because they've ignored their kids, probably for 15 years, because of the amount of obsessive attention that one has to give to the so-called Church of Scientology, the institution, the mothership, in order to progress in it, does not leave time for raising children. They're also they're indoctrinated from the second you walk in that we are all fallen trillion-year-old gods that have lived billions of lives, and that we're stuck in a meat body on a prison planet in a degraded state. And the whole point of Scientology processes, as you move up its ladder, is to shed yourself of the earthly traps and entanglements that are keeping you from your native godlike state. So if you've lived billions of lives, and you've learned and been educated billions of times, and you're living in this degraded meat body, literally the body in Scientology is considered a prison vessel of a god on a prison planet of Earth, so of a fallen god, you believe this. Scientologists believe this. So over those billions of lives, most Scientologists believe that you've been my parent before, I've been your daughter before, I've been your wife before, and all these entanglements of lives. We've lived every form of existence we could possibly live. Now, what Hubbard has said is, the only chance this planet has is in this moment of this faint chance we have in this moment of what we do here and now in Scientology. I'm paraphrasing. And the idea is that without Scientology, the Earth is eminently going to destroy itself and burn, likely in nuclear fire or some other environmental disaster that destroys the entire planet. So we have a very limited amount of time before that happens. So the luxury of education, the luxury of having a loving relationship with your child, and of course there are exceptions to this. There's plenty of loving Scientology parents that you just can't stop them from being a loving person. It's human beings, but for the majority, they really believe this, and so they don't know the living conditions in there. They don't go and examine the dorms. It's not like they're dropping their kids off at college. They believe that they're doing something noble, and in many cases where this was at the worst, we're talking about baby boomers doing this, which can tend to be a narcissistic generation, and ultimately they would have what I would call it's complicated, but ultimately what you see over and over and over is a form of noble cause narcissism. They've already been groomed into ignoring their kids for 10 to 15 years. Now their kid is semi-educated and believes in all this stuff. So the best thing to do would be there's nothing more noble you could do as a dedicated adherent than to turn your kids over to the system that will save the planet before it burns up in the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's really the mindset. It's hard to believe, but anybody that has been in the so-called Sea organization for any length of time, or been around Scientology for any length of time, knows that what I'm saying is exactly true.
Yes. So you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a classic economic slave system fused to noble narcissism. Therefore, children are a throwaway because we lived so many lives before. What is this lifetime, right? And I'd like to continue the conversation. Jamie, I deeply appreciate your scholarship and your sensitivity. I know when we talk, sometimes it's hard for you to talk, but I think it's important for you to tell your story. And I appreciate your scholarship in reframing this in terms of a classic economic slavery model, because that elevates the discourse into an important area that scholars need to understand. People on the outside need to understand what's going on. And that's part of what I wanted to do with my own work, is to talk about the actual structure of it. And you've given like the internal economic slavery, which I couldn't describe because it's not a lived experience for me. And you published the book, which are important elements to put in place. So I think I look forward to our future conversation. I thank you for coming on today. And
Thank you for
thank
thank you for having me, and thank you
yeah,
for having me the sensitivity to listen to me and adjust and help reframe what this actually is, because it's so important that we call it what it actually is, which is an economic chattel slave system. It's important
yeah.
that we call it that, because if we want to release it, we have to see it for what it is.
Well, yes, we have to redefine the narrative into the correct, and by using a sophisticated approach, you're going to reach decision makers more effectively.
Yeah, by explaining
And
exactly what something is, the better
yeah,
chance you have to repair it. If you have this system where it's just a bunch of goofy kids joining a system because they didn't like, because of purely the uh, the the absolute mental pressure cooker of the 1960s. I mean, that is part of it. But if you don't define the treatment of children and the system of indoctrination when you move into the paramilitary part of it, as if you can't explain it directly as the slave system that it is, you can't repair it. Because if
no,
if you're looking at it as a bunch of goofy kids joining a group, when it's actually an economic system modeled after chattel slavery, when you see it like that, the fact that we could rectify it or get it removed or changed, I think that when you call it what it is, the odds that it can be fixed go up much higher. For
yes,
lack of a better.
and on our next, I look forward to doing a series of these. I want to redefine in your terms, chattel slavery system, and away from religious worker and the other lies that the Church of Scientology has used, the so-called church, or redefine it properly, its proper context. Uh, so thank you for coming on. The book is Child X. Jamie, what is your website and where can people get the book?
I think that people get the book everywhere where all books are
Yeah.
sold. So it's on bookstores all over the country.
So Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Yeah. It's at Barnes and Noble. So just if you Google the book, the Amazon link will come right up. Hopefully you'll put it in the show description.
I will. It's already in there.
The best way to reach me is on Instagram, Jamie, JAMIE _MUSTARD. And I hear from people every day about my work because I've written a few books, and I love to hear from people. And if you feel like anything we're talking about here, where you want to reach out, reach out.
Okay. Thank you for being on, Jamie Mustard, and it's Jeffrey Augustine for the Scientology Money Project. And we look forward to having you on again, Jamie. That's my music. Something to go out on. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time.